Yeah.
And he didn't receive any help, and they didn't care because they watched him die. They watched a dead man. They watched a man dying at their feet. I mean, my brother would have been, he might have been crying out for help. Imagine dying on a cold concrete floor at Brixton Police Station with officers standing around you who's doing nothing to help you. And what they're doing is they're covering up.
Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone. Keep your hand on your gun. Don't you trust anyone.
Welcome to Truth to Power. This is Lowkey. On the 21st of August 2008, Sean Rigg was apprehended by the Metropolitan Police. He later died in police custody, in circumstances which bear a striking similarity to the death of George Floyd in 2019. He was subjected to 8 minutes of positional pressure leading to asphyxiation. Today, we meet with a member of his family who has spent the last 13 years struggling for justice for Sean Rigg. We are joined by campaigner, political activist, and member of the United Families and Friends campaign, Marcia Rigg. Thank you so much for joining us today, Marcia.
Thank you very much for having me, Lowkey.
It's going to be great to have this conversation with you. Firstly, I wanted to ask you if you could tell me what it was like with your brother, Sean Rigg.
My brother was a charming young gentleman. He was artistic. He was a musician, so he wrote his own lyrics, and he was a rap artist, and he was well-traveled. Sean loved his food, and he always spent Christmas at my house as the eldest sister, and just having fun, laughing, and eating. There's lots of great memories of Sean. You know, I really miss him. He was a really nice guy. Unfortunately, he suffered with mental health, and he had experimented on one occasion with drugs, and he really had a bad trip. So he didn't have any previous issues with mental health. But after that incident, he was then diagnosed with acute schizophrenia, and he entered what we call a revolving door system, which in the end kills him. But he lived a relatively normal life. He was not a criminal. And most people didn't realize that he suffered with mental health because he managed it quite well. Occasionally, he wouldn't take his medication, which is part of the symptoms. And that's when he would be actively psychotic and paranoid, which is part of the illness. But mental illness does not kill you, does it?
If you could run down for us what happened on August the 21st, 2008.
Well, basically, in a nutshell, my brother received a death sentence where deadly force was used on a vulnerable man. Basically, he was very unwell that day. He hadn't taken his medication. I had a really close relationship with his mental health team. And so there was a series of emergency 999 calls that had been made to the police by his mental health care team at the hostel where he lived in Brixton. And they had contacted the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, SLAM, which was the trust that Sean was, received his care. And they said that there were no beds. They said to call the police. And so the hostel staff, which is like a half warehouse where my brother lived, called the police. they wanted him to be taken to a place of safety, which was a hospital. But the police didn't come. And so after about 3 hours, Sean goes onto the street. In fact, the family, we have footage of those 3 hours of Sean, where he was in and out of the garden. He's obviously unwell, but he wasn't injured in any way. He just wasn't recognizing people that the hostel, his care team had said. He wasn't even recognizing them, so he was very unwell. And when he went onto the streets, members of the public could see this as well, because he was behaving bizarrely. He was in and out of traffic. He could have been run over, or he could have hurt himself or somebody else. So he was kicking out. Sean was specialized in Wing Chun, and he was doing that on the day that he died in the streets. He was doing it earlier on at the hostel and in the street. So he was making the stances. But nobody was hurt. He didn't make contact with anyone. In fact, nobody was hurt that day apart from Sean, because members of the public could see that he was unwell and they called the police. The police arrived, and Sean was apprehended at 7:40 p.m. The officers claimed that Sean was in a karate stance move, and the officer was scared, and they tackled on the floor, something like that, and that Sean had assaulted one of the officers, PC forward, in his head. Later on we found out that he didn't need any medical assistance, and there was no serious injury.
This
by
is
his
PC
own
forward.
PC forward.
Did not need medical assistance.
No, by his own accounts, he wasn't injured, and it said that he says that on the CCTV footage that I've seen. So he was restrained, face down, in grass. He had been handcuffed to the rear, which took about 30 seconds, by 4 officers: Glasson, Harrott, Forward, and Burks. And there were witnesses to that restraint. And the officer said that Glasson was on Sean's neck, using his arm and his knees on his back. There is photographic evidence, because luckily a member of the public had taken 2 photographs. He was searched because PC Forward, who was at his feet, had removed his shoes, and Sean was carrying his passport. He was only carrying his passport that day. He didn't carry his keys or his mobile phone, and I will never know where Sean was going that day or what was in his mind. The other officer, PC Glasson, is at Sean's neck area. Now, the witnesses at the jury found that he would have been in that position for 8 minutes, face down in grass. The officers in their evidence claimed that they had turned him on his side so that he could breathe, presumably as part of their training. But the photograph that the one witness had taken was 2 separate photographs in the space of about 4 minutes. And Sean was still in the same position. So the officers claim in their evidence that, they don't remember at which time they turned him on his side, but they could have turned him on his side in the middle of those 4 minutes or before or after. My argument is that if they had turned him on his side, why is he dead? He was then brought to his knees and taken to the van, where the officers, he did walk, but he was assisted, and the officers were claiming that he was kind of resistant because he was kind of swaying. I don't remember their exact words, but he was taken to the van, and there were witnesses. Sean had injuries to the side of his face, where the officers claimed that when they were putting him in the van, he bumped his head. It's my understanding in their training, if somebody's going in the van, that they would hold them down, so that doesn't happen. But there were some unexplained injuries. And he was put in the van, and the officers said that he was seated, and then he slumped down into the footwell. So you could imagine our two seats in the back of a caged van, and Sean was in the footwell. The footwell area, is no bigger than this space. The jury at the inquest found that Sean would have been in a V position the entire time he was in the van because of the space. In
the V position?
Yeah. So he would have been either in this position, because he can't stretch out his feet, because it's a very small area if sitting. So he would have been in this position or the opposite, which is called hog tie. So he would have been either that position or position at the back. There is a locked cage, and he would have been inside there, which is perspex material, so that means you can see through. And so the officers were watching him like I'm looking at you. They were this close, perhaps even a little bit closer. They thought nothing of it. They didn't recognise he had mental health issues, they said. And they sped back to the station on their blues and twos. The footage clearly shows that the van, was mounting the pavement to get through the traffic. And he was being taken to Brixton Police Station. I do not understand why they would have been on their blues and twos as an emergency.
Did PC Burks at any point offer any explanation for why he was driving so fast?
And I think he said there was a medical emergency. I can't recall the exact words, but I think that was the reason that he gave. But then why didn't they take him to the hospital? And this later becomes relevant, because if it was a medical emergency, when they did arrive to the station, they didn't bring a doctor straight away. In fact, what happened is that they did speed back to the station, and they arrived at the station at 7:53. Sean was kept at the back of the van for a period of 11 minutes because they said that the custody suite was busy and that there was a violent man coming in and they needed to clear the custody suite. Sergeant White then claimed that he did a risk assessment and went to the van, and he looked at Sean, and Sean was sitting up on the chair with his head to his side, and he looked directly at Sean, directly into his eyes was his evidence, and that he shouted at Sean. I wondered why he shouted, but I suppose if somebody is in and out of consciousness, you would say, "Lowkey," and you would respond. He said Sean didn't respond, but that he opened his eyes, I think, or he looked at it. There was I can't remember his exact words, but he said Sean didn't flinch, basically, and he had looked him in his eyes. That was incorrect, because he never entered. He never left the custody suite. We proved that he didn't go and look in the van. So one should consider as to why did he say that. And my belief is that they had to say that to show that Sean was fine in the van, and there was nothing wrong with him. But in reality, it was found that he would have been dying in the van. He did die shortly after, because after 11 minutes, Sean was removed in a collapsed state where it is caught on camera. There was a camera on the station yard that would have given a bird's eye view, so we would have known what was happening there. But we were told by the IPCC that there was not a camera there. When we told them that we knew for a fact that there was, and my legal team had requested all the cameras and the maps of all the cameras in Brixton Police Station, the IPCC then came to say that Christopher Patridge was the investigator at the time, a person that I would really love to find because he retired. He said, "Oh yeah, sorry, they do exist. The camera does exist," because there was another one that was apparently not working as well. When Sean was removed and brought into the caged area where he died, there was a camera there too, a bird's eye view. They claimed that those cameras there were no cameras there, and we said there is. And then they came back and said, "Oh, sorry, there are cameras there, but they've not been working for 3 months." And we were like, "Really? This Brixton Police Station?" There are security cameras. It's one of the most notorious stations in London, and there's no cameras there.
For 3 months.
For 3 months. We then made a complaint to the IPCC. We made a complaint about the cameras. And we said, well, who maintains the cameras at Brixton Police Station? When were they last maintained? And it forced an investigation and a report, which has never been put in the public domain. But that report found that the cameras had been maintained 9 days before Sean died, and that all the cameras were working. I am not aware of a member of the public taking any footage of the restraint, but there was photographic evidence. So there's no footage of that. We only have the accounts of the officers. In those days, there were no body-worn cameras. You know, I later campaigned for that, and that's why we now have cameras in police vehicles and body-worn cameras after Sean's death. Because I argued with Sir Bergen Hogan Howe at the time, who was the commissioner of the police, and the IPCC, that if there was cameras in the back of the vehicle, we would have known exactly what happened to Sean. But they took the accounts of the officers, where they were the only witnesses, and they gave implausible accounts. By the time Sean was removed at 8:03, there's no camera footage. But there is a camera at the yard, at the gate. We were able to get that enhanced. So as a family, we saw the footage after a couple of weeks of Sean dying. We saw uncut footage at the IPCC's office. So we knew that there was footage existing where he apparently walked, you know, where he was taken out of the van. And we said, where is that footage? Because we know it exists. And we made a judicial review with the coroner. We had a pre-inquest review where we argued this, that we wanted to get the full footage because 29 seconds were missing, which was quite interesting. And of course, we did get that. And we get the camera footage from the gate yard. So there's when the gate were to come in the yard, there's a camera there. We got that emphasized. So you see. So when he does appear on camera, when Sean appears on camera, he's heavily assisted by 2 officers.
Assisted?
He's heavily assisted, carried by the shoulders by 2 officers. Remember, he's been restrained for 8 minutes. So there was a lack of oxygen going to his brain. He would have been in and out of consciousness in the van. I think the walk was 7 seconds. And he's on the floor in the caged area. He never enters the custody suite. He's on the floor. Oh, he just wanted to sleep. We've got a violent man that's handcuffed, that's been kicking out in the street. It's Brixton Police Station. He's come to the entrance, and you've allowed him to just sleep. Really? But at this point, he's caught on camera. The camera above him apparently was not working, but there is another camera in the hall, in the corridor inside the station, which captures. So Sean's on the floor and the officers standing around him. Yeah. And he didn't receive any help, and they didn't care because they watched him die. They watched a dead man. They watched a man dying at their feet. I mean, my brother would have been, he might have been crying out for help. Imagine dying on a cold concrete floor at Brixton Police Station with officers standing around you who's doing nothing to help you. And what they're doing is they're covering up. I urge the government, the British government, and globally as well, to take heed to finally make officers accountable for their wrongdoing, so that there is a clear message to them that if they restrain somebody to death, use deadly force, I call it. They call it excessive force. It's not excessive for them. The Metropolitan Police found in my brother's case, because, you know, the jury said it was 8 minutes. Then it was reduced to 7 minutes when there was a criminal investigation. 7 minutes is too long. But it was found, and the Met said it wasn't excessive. Where I said, well, they have a license to kill. Because if 7 minutes is not excessive to the point of death, deadly force, then we've got no chance. That means they can kill you. And it is not excessive. Really?
Now, Marcia, when you were forced into beginning your fight for justice, you were put through what seems like quite a ridiculous legal aid means test in order to do this. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So families do not receive automatic funding to find out how their loved one died and to have legal representation at the inquest. In stark contrast, agents of the state, police, London Ambulance Service, mental health services, prisons, receive automatic, unlimited funding from the public purse to argue their innocence. But families have to complete a very intrusive means testing form. They want to know everything. They want to know if you have jewelry under the floorboards. They want to know what my father, who died 8 years before, left us. You know, they want to know all your assets. And to cut a long story short, they wanted £21,000 from my family for me to pay, for us to pay towards, to find out how Sean died. And we refused. I was so angry, we were so angry. And we refused, and in the end we argued the point with the coroner, and in the end I think we had to contribute £5,000, which we got back. But the fact is that families like mine, you know, could lose all their savings, their pensions, their property. There's families that have lost everything because they can't get legal aid. So it is a cutthroat battle that we go through, and we're not on the battlefield. It's not fair. They're on the battlefield and we're trying to get on it. Yeah, they're fighting us. We're not in the battle with them.
The death was recorded as cardiac arrest, but the coroners added partial positional asphyxia. Also, as far as I understand, when you were allowed to see Sean, there were wounds that you were not told about in the autopsy. What do you make of all of that?
It was the jury, the inquest jury. They were allowed to give 3 causes of death. But if I remember rightly, during their deliberations, they asked if they could put something else, which was partial positional asphyxiation because of the restraint, which then caused there to be ischemia, which is a lack of oxygen that will go to the brain because of the restraint, which then causes an arrhythmia to the heart, either it's beating fast or slow, which causes a cardiac arrest. Because everybody has a cardiac arrest when they die. It just means that your heart stopped.
Yeah.
Right. That's what happened to Sean. That's what happened to George Floyd.
Yeah.
Okay. Their initial accounts in the press was all, he had a heart attack. Even after years later, he did not have a heart attack.
Yeah.
He had a cardiac arrest because of the restraint. So that is really important. And they also found that the actions of the officers contributed to his death, which was the restraint, the time that he was in the van, because he would have been in a compromising position.
Yeah.
Because if he would have been like this or the other way, hogtie, right? Because of the restraint, he can't breathe properly. So he's still being restrained. And then in the back of the van for 11 minutes, they also said that was inappropriate. He's still being restrained. He's brought into the caged area. He's still being restrained. He's then put in a prone position again.
So it's constant positional asphyxia, it seems. more than just the 8 minutes before he got in the van?
I have to be very careful with the medical terms, because the issue here was very concerning. This is what happens at an inquest. The argument will be causation. What actually caused the death? And that's what the police barristers will argue. Was it the restraint? Did he have a bad heart? Did he take drugs? Because, they were trying to say excited delirium and all this nonsense. Mental health doesn't kill you, but restraint does. But they do everything to take away the effects of the restraint. Okay, so, yeah, it was a combination. That's why he died.
So what we see is really, over 10 years, an attritional struggle where every single small victory has had to have been fought for tooth and nail, basically.
100%.
And sort of prized from their hands. We're seeing now the Spy Cops inquiry revealing that even the Stephen Lawrence family were surveilled, despite the unquestionably important place that family now serves as part of British society. Their campaign was infiltrated and spied upon, along with over 1,000 other political groups since 1968. What do you think the likelihood is that you and others alongside you fighting for justice for Sean have been spied upon?
100%. I have no doubt that my family and myself have or are being spied on. And it's something that happens with families like mine, like Joy Gardner's family, Roger Sylvester's family, Lee Lawrence, the Cherry Gross family. It's standard procedure. All families are surveillanced. Because basically they want to know what you're doing. And I think their argument is they believe there's going to be community unrest, i.e. riots. In the spies, there's recent, in the Spy Cops case, they were under surveillance. I can't remember which the body was, the police.
Special Demonstration Squad. Yeah.
Which ended in 2008. I don't know who or what, or what they do now, but I also recall, having my phone being tapped at certain times in the case, in conversations. I could hear it when I'm talking to my solicitor. And I recall having a meeting at the time when Theresa May was the Home Secretary, and myself and some other families had the opportunity to meet her with her officials in her office. And this was something that I actually brought up about surveillance, that I believed that I was being surveillanced. And she said something to the words of, it would have had to be an order from the Home Office for that to happen. And, she was suggesting that, unless it was ordered specifically by the Home Office for me to be surveillanced, there's no way you could be. Standard procedure for families to be surveillanced, I have no doubt.
Can you tell us about the recent UN report which you had some involvement in?
Yeah. Now, this report is very critical and damaging following the death of George Floyd, where the High Commissioner, the United Nations, were looking at this issue globally. And as you said earlier, I work with families in the United Families and Friends campaign, and some of us gave evidence to the United Nations. We sent in evidence. And I also work with the charity inquest that works with families like mine and a group of families. We also gave evidence via inquest to the United Nations. But I was personally invited. It was confidential at the time, but I've been told that I can say so. Now that the report has been made public, that I met with with the High Commissioner, along with the brother of George Floyd and the mother of Breonna Taylor and the other families that's mentioned in the report. And, you know, it was an honor to meet them, but it's just sad that we had to meet in these circumstances. And that our experience was striking. You know, I remember saying to George's brother that, you know, Sean died just like your brother, you know, asphyxiation, which, arrhythmia, all of these things came up in the trial, which I watched, yeah. So this report is very important, along with all the previous reports. But I'm hoping that this report will make a difference, because it's the United Nations that's been saying what families have been saying for years, what the Macpherson report has been saying, you know, what the Scarman report has been saying, what the Casale report was saying, what the Angelini review was saying, what the Lamy report was saying, all the 50-odd reports perhaps that over the years has been saying, yeah, where there's not been any real effective change. There's not been a willingness by the government. You know, that report cited the death of Kevin Clark. Kevin Clark was killed by Lewisham police officers in 2018. They were wearing body-worn cameras, where it's caught on camera, where Kevin is saying, I can't breathe, and you're killing me, like George Floyd. So that was a really important case, and that was cited in the report. Yeah? And so, while the world is watching, the issues of deaths in custody and the issues of racism, where black men are portrayed as big, bad and dangerous, and they've got superhuman strength, and that excited delirium can kill them. You know, they can excite themselves to death. And that a restraint of you know, force that you can see on camera, you know, that the medical evidence will prove, has got nothing to do with the death. Well, it's time for change. You know, my campaign is called Justice and Change. You know, change is coming. But we have to force them, you know, because we should be saving lives. They're not saving lives. The government are not saving lives. They keep saying lessons will be learnt, but they've not learnt their lessons because they've not been willing. They're, as far as I'm concerned, they've become more, I want to find the right word. They've become more...
Entrenched?
Pardon?
Entrenched?
Yeah, and organised in how to cover it up with all these cases, you know. And they just refuse to accept that they have done wrong. And the UN report said that officers should now should not have impunity. Yeah, because it's obvious that they have impunity and a license to kill.
I think the reality is that those like us are not outnumbered, we are out-organised. And when we look at the recent conviction for manslaughter, it was only an 8-year sentence that was given to an officer involved in the death of Dalian Atkinson. We see a direct correlation between what they understand to be social unrest, which was last year demonstrations sweeping across the country in support of Black Lives Matter, and the ways in which these institutions respond to that pressure. And the more that we are able to build those conditions outside of the institutions of power, do you see hope in that model of widespread demonstration and protest potentially applying enough pressure to the levers of power that they have to respond even in this limited way?
Only if they care. They don't care. You know, they keep saying, you know, community unrest and riots. We call it uprisings, you know, because it's a language of pain, you know, by the public, by the community, yeah. You know, we have a saying, no justice, no peace. They try to interpret that the no peace is violence. It's not. We all entitled to protest. You know, we're talking about deaths, murder and manslaughter. You know, the biggest insult that it can be given to a family. The fact that we all face death at some point in our family. I remember another time when I said to Theresa May, because when your loved one dies in state custody, the body belongs to the state. It belongs to the Home Office, not the family. They literally seize the evidence. I said to Theresa May, Theresa, imagine your loved one dies and you can't go and say goodbye or kiss them, you know. She understood that, which is why she commissioned her officials into the IPCC. That's how the Angelini Review came about, with the mother of the parents of Shani Lewis and myself, and 2 other families, James Herbert and Thomas Orchard, who were white. Yeah, they killed their own too, but there's a disproportionality in black deaths, and so a mass campaign, including protests and the Black Lives Matter issue, is absolutely vital, because it's a language, yeah, peacefully. It's usually, you know, members of the public will say, and families, that the police will sometimes encourage the violence. Let's get this straight here. And so it is important that we must have hope, because even a pandemic, when George died, a pandemic could not stop the uprising. That is how powerful it is. And so we have to cling on to hope for justice, to make change, like our ancestors did when we were enslaved and taken into custody and chained against our wills and put on the ship, and they died. They were deaths in custody. So what's changed? You know, apart from time. You know, there's an old Jamaican saying, time longer than rope. Time is longer than rope. Their rope is finished. It's now time for real justice and to save lives, because our loved ones' blood, my brother's blood is crying out from the ground. It's overflowing in the United Kingdom and globally. And that's why it's absolutely vital. That's why I speak, to highlight the fact that deaths like George happen in the United Kingdom. There's many George Floyds, yeah? But it is an opportune moment in time for there to be real effective change. So we've seen an officer go to prison for the death of Dalian Atkinson. It's quite extraordinary that these 2 things have happened at the same time in America. Someone went for 22 years and a half years for killing George, but somebody in Britain as well. But it's not as highlighted as it ought to be. It's not headline news. And that's the first time in the United Kingdom, over 35 years, for somebody to go to prison for killing somebody. But 8 years is not long enough. The sentence does not reflect the crime, and he will probably do 5 years or so. But my solidarity lies with the family. We stand in solidarity with Dalian's family, and it is a step in the right direction that somebody has finally gone to prison, even though it's not enough. But it's a start. Yeah? And that's why hope is so important, because we are winning right now and Babylon is falling.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your dignity. In any way that me or any of us can be in assistance to what you do, please let me know. We're here till the end.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Power to the people. Every time. Thank you all so much. Thank you. It's fine, it's good, I'm good. My tears will catch them. The mother of George Floyd, of Joy Gardner. Our tears will catch them. Because it takes a human story to change. a human heart.
Absolutely.